Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lesson. It's following on from the first lesson in this new series on landscape sketching. The first lesson covered the theory of angles and aerial perspective, which basically is an introduction to how to look at the landscape and think about how it's sort of formulated. And this week we are going to be looking at how you can crop, compose and start blocking in your landscape sketches. This is something that seems quite simple on the surface, but tends to be a bit of a sticking point for students when they first start working outdoors. So this is we're imagining that you're working on plein air, so you're working out in the open doors, or working in the outdoors. So you're not working, in this instance I do have a couple of reference photos of different landscapes that I'm going to be demonstrating the principles with. But imagine that you've got this scene that surrounds you, that you walked out into this kind of space, or kind of a local park or something, and you want to be able to pick, select, and then copy something that you see. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough, so I might be coughing a bit during this lesson. Yeah, you want to be able to go into the landscape, select a specific region, and copy that. Which sounds really simple, but when you're actually sort of surrounded by a three-dimensional space and you've got all your peripheral vision, it can be difficult when you start drawing, or when you start particularly painting, to make sure that everything that you're drawing is kept within the kind of confines of whatever portion of the scene you choose to depict is. So the first thing that you need to be able to do is decide where you're going to draw and crop it, basically, but crop it visually. You can get these things called viewfinders, which are kind of little rectangles that you kind of put over your scene, and it helps you to crop. The other thing that you can do, which I didn't actually add into the documents to go alongside this course, but nowadays, most people have smartphones on them. If you use a smartphone or a camera, if you've got a camera with a viewfinder, you can take a photo of whatever it is that you want to draw, and then crop it down on your camera, and it kind of gives you an idea of how you would copy it and what sorts of things you're going to see depending on the proportions of your drawing or painting, what you'll actually see in the painting out of the whole scene. But what we're going to look at today is how you can do that without any tools, basically, just by using your eyes, and that's all. We'll be using a few measurement tools, but essentially just using your eyes. So, the first thing that we need to do is choose our horizontal boundaries, which tend to be a lot clearer than the vertical boundaries. So when I say horizontal, I mean if you've got your scene kind of running basically sideways is your horizontal boundary, and then your vertical boundaries, kind of like longitudinal and latitudinal lines on your drawings. So I'm going to do a couple of different crops on these two scenes. So I specifically chose quite large kind of panoramic vistas, so that I've got different elements that I could pick, because an aspect of cropping is composition. We're going to go a little bit more heavily into composition near the end of this lesson, but when you're cropping, it's about composition. So if I crop, let's say we look at this section in here, this little bit here. You won't even be able to see my pen marks, but let's imagine a little square that just takes in that part of the scene. It's not as interesting as if you just nudge it up a little bit and you incorporate part of the sky alongside the tree line, so you get this kind of interesting edge. That's a compositional aspect of how you crop your image. So that's what you want to be thinking about when you first choose what you're going to paint. As I say, I'm going to go into composition a little bit more in a second. Basically, you want to pick I'm going to use these coloured markers. Visually, you want to pick some kind of landmark in the scene that you're going to be able to go back and reference. So it has to be static, and it has to be quite unique so that you can quite easily pick it out. So you don't want to pick one of the trees further back, because they all look quite similar to each other and there's a lot of them. So if you're going to pick some sort of boundary, try to pick something, say it's a tree. The edge of this clump of foreground trees, I could make my left-hand boundary. I'm just going to rotate this so it's a bit clearer for the camera. So the very left-hand side of those trees is my left-hand boundary. So then I'm going to carry on and try to find something on the right-hand side that will form my right-hand boundary. Now, I could make it kind of a portrait image and come out to where this little section of this bit of land kind of is still visible in the distance as it fades away. So you could do something like that. That's a landmark that's going to remain the same. I could pick this little floating island as a landmark. Or I would probably, if I was actually painting the scene, I would want to incorporate that as it's a nice little compositional element. So maybe I would pick the edge of this bit of land. So it's not visible, it's not going to be visible in my painting, but I'm going to use it as a boundary, as a marker point. So I now have my left hand boundary and my right hand boundary set. So obviously it's quite clear with these pens in the way, but if I remove them, we can still quite easily return to this edge of this clump of trees and this little spit of land on the right hand side of the image that's jutting out. So I'm always going to use those as my two boundaries. I won't be drawing or painting anything that falls outside of those two confinements. Now, once I've chosen those, I can define my kind of the bottommost reaches of my drawing and the topmost reaches. So again, you're trying to do the same thing. It can be a bit trickier. It's a bit easier in the foreground usually. So I might say that my image will finish just at this little white clump of lighter rocks. So if I conceal them, we're kind of cropping up a little bit from the bottom of the photograph. Obviously in real life the ground would extend towards you and you'd be picking a spot. So I'm going to use those as my bottom confinement, put this back up. And this one. So what we're ending up with is something that maybe would be a square. If you've got a square canvas, it would be a really ideal composition. Now, usually the trickiest place to put your boundary is the top of the scene, because very often the sky is in the top of the scene, and the sky is variable. Everything in the rest of this image is static. These clouds in 30 seconds are going to look different. In 5 minutes, there'll be a completely different set of clouds. They won't just be in a different place, they will be entirely different. So one thing you can do is choose a point at which one of your other boundaries intersects with something in the scene. So in this case, we've got this mountainside that's climbing up. So if I was to lay this over, getting a little bit of shadow. But you can see basically I'm using this point. If I was to draw a straight line up, where would it intersect this mountainside? So there we go, and then it will carry across sideways. If I draw another straight line up, that runs through where that spit of land is, and another line down here. Probably won't be that visible to you, but we end up with something pretty much a square composition if I bring it a bit closer to you guys. But you can see that's how I frame the image. So the entire time I'm working, I don't ever want to go outside of these boundaries. What students struggle with is they start working and they don't have any kind of clearly defined boundaries when they first begin their drawing or painting. So maybe they draw something in the middle, so they draw a nice tree in the center of the piece, and then they think, oh, this tree must be this far away from it on their canvas that they obviously have, or their paper. I'll just put it arbitrarily here, and then I'll put another thing there, and then I'll work that way, and suddenly they realize they've kind of completely distorted the proportions of what they're drawing, and they can't capture something that looks like what it was they wanted to capture in the first place. But yeah, essentially that's how you crop. So I'm going to do it really quickly on this other scene, and as you can see, it's slightly different. We've got some trees in the background, got this farmhouse. So a lot of good static points horizontally to pick. So let's say I want to keep these little sheds or these barns on the right hand side. I need to find a point that's a little bit to the right of them as my right hand boundary. And I don't know if you can maybe not quite make it out, but there are some useful electrical towers in the distance. So if I use one of those on the right hand side, That can be my right hand boundary, so I've got a little bit of space on the side of my buildings. Then maybe I want to get all the other buildings in this tree. I have to look for something else. And this left hand side is a little bit trickier, because if I want to incorporate, I could use that tree as my boundary, but I feel like it balances out the scene quite nicely, so I want to keep it in. If I use the point at which this set of trees ends in the distance, that pretty much matches the edge of that tree, so I need to find something in the very far distance to use as a marker. So a slightly tricky one, but something that will remain the same. There's this basically like a little section of clear ground in the middle of this clump of trees. I'm going to use the right hand side of that as my left hand marker. So put this back in place. I'll bring that a little bit closer just so you can see what I'm talking about. Just here, there's kind of a paler section of land that I've just drawn over there. The right hand side of that bit of visible land is the left hand side of my image. So I'll put that left hand boundary in, put this one back. Then for my, this is quite an easy one, so my horizontal or vertical lower boundary will be this, seems like a path or something running between the fields. So that's a really easy one to pop in. And for my top boundary, this one's easier because we don't have the sky, we've got the landscape behind. I'm going to pick roughly where these trees are kind of descending down. That way I capture there's some little houses on the hillside there that are quite nice, make for a nice arrangement within the darker mass. So this time we've ended up with something a lot more horizontal, but again, all my boundaries are pretty clearly defined. So if I just reinforce them, got one boundary there, then we're using this one on the left hand side, then got that electrical tower, and this bit of land. So again, whenever I'm drawing this scene, I don't want to go outside of those marks. Now, obviously the marks don't exist on paper, they have to exist in your mind, but the reason we choose very specific landmarks is you can always refer back to them. So when you're drawing and you're painting, just always keep in your mind, I'm not going to go outside of these boundaries. That way you'll crop effectively. Now, before we get into how you actually go about fitting this scene in, I want to talk a little bit about composition, and specifically one kind of basic principle of composition which can be really useful in landscape painting. It's useful in all forms of painting, but landscape painting particularly, you'll find it come in handy. And it's basically named after a thing called a steel yard. I've got a document that goes along with this on the blog and the OCAD course page. But basically a steel yard was a type of measuring tool for weights that has a fulcrum in the center that everything hangs off. So basically it hangs down, has a little fulcrum, then it has a fixed weight on one side that's usually quite heavy, close to the center, and then an extendable arm that kind of sticks out, or it's a long arm that has this kind of extendable little section that slides along backwards and forwards and has a smaller weight. So physics causes the objects closer to the fulcrum basically have to weigh more to counteract the extension of a lighter weight that's further away from the fulcrum. And weirdly, the same principle can apply quite effectively in compositions. So we're going to look at this visually. Essentially, you have a... I'll try to zoom in on this a little bit. Okay. Draw a slightly different box here. So, sketch. So if this is your rectangle that you're working within, the confines of your drawing, if you have, for instance, we'll go back to that reference we were just using, you've got like a big barn or something like that looming on the left hand side of the image. I draw in too much detail. Let's say it's sort of in shadow a bit, particularly this right hand side of it. The whole thing's moderately dark. So that's kind of sitting on this side of the picture. We've got our horizon somewhere behind over here, and it's quite a bare picture, so we've just got sky, ground, and this this barn. So we've got this kind of empty space that sits on the left hand side of the image, and visually, kind of compositionally visually, it feels like the right hand side of the image is heavy. So you look at it and you kind of feel like the image is tilting to the right. And this happens a lot when you've got any kind of composition which loads too much stuff on the right hand side of the scene. I'm sure you're aware of some other rules of composition, like the rule of thirds, where you have, if you divide your image into thirds in any given direction, you kind of want important points to fall roughly around those lines of thirds. And that's also a useful tool to use. There's a slightly different kind of rule to apply in conjunction, this steel yard. So if we've got this large group or large mass sitting nearish to one side of the image, occupying a large space, to balance it out, we're going to need, if we were to put, say we were to put a darker note, so something higher contrast stands out more, so you can already see that kind of pops out against this this house. This little point I put in is too close to that one, it's too far on the right hand side. It's not creating balance across the center of the image, it falls roughly at the center of the image. To try to create balance, I'm going to need to put something of interest, let's say maybe a much darker little, not sure what it is, it's just going to be a random little dark blob. But you can see that creates a sense of visual balance. Now, if we do the same thing again, we draw another box, and we draw a horizon, and this time we move our barn so that it kind of falls over the center. I'm going to have to extend it out a little bit. Can extend it this way this time. So that's quite close to the center. If we were to do the same thing and put a dark note all the way out to the right, the right here, sorry, the right hand side here, it starts to feel like it's going to tilt to the left. So we put that dark note too far. We would probably want it to feel balanced, maybe about here, and quite a small note. That's the most that we could get out of it. So if you're applying this to your scenes, you might have instances where you've got some sort of hillside, and you might have kind of, say it's sort of a coniferous forest somewhere up on the hillside. They tend to grow in kind of dark masses that are all quite unified. We end up with this quite kind of dominant mass of trees on the side of the hill. Say our land's a little bit lighter. Just separate it from the sky. We want something of note here, and you might just find, a nice little solitary tree. Creates a nice sense of balance in that image. You could then bisect it with maybe a pathway running down the center. But you want to make that tree slightly darker, and certainly surrounded by kind of an empty space. That way it'll start to balance against this larger clump of trees. Now the same rule can apply in space through the image. So if you've got a large, say, let me draw this out again. Let's say we've got a hillside that's sloping down and then another hill behind. And again we've got, let's say, a clump of trees that's kind of closer to us on this near hillside. So it's sort of flowing over a little bit. And this distant hillside is a little bit lighter. So what you end up with is this kind of sense of space going backwards in the distance. So it's kind of travelling that way, away from us. So if we were to put a smaller clump of trees over here in this distant point, because there's a sense of visually travelling through the image, travelling in space through the image, in sort of perspective you can create a sense of balance. So we're looking through the image at this little group of trees in the background, and it creates a sense of balance in the same way that this kind of purely horizontal balance is created using the Steelyard principle. So the final thing we're going to look at really quickly is how you can measure within your crop marks that you create while you're working. So we'll go back to this scene here. Now, to make sure you're actually really making use of these boundaries that you've created in your head, you want to figure out where everything falls as a portion of the whole. So if you've watched any of my measuring videos, they go through this. But we basically want to look at, from this point here, how many, holding our pen out in front of us, so we'd hold it out like this in front of the scene as we're working. Hold your arm straight. You basically just want to count how many times does this gap from the boundary on the right hand side to the edge of this house, how many times does that fit? 2, 3. So a little bit over, 1, 2, 3, a little bit over 3.5 times. So we know that that's a bit under a third, so probably a third of the image is about there. So the edge of these buildings is about a third. If we wanted to measure the exact width of them within the whole scene, we can just look at, to pull our thumb up to the right hand side of this building, then go back to the outside edge of the box, 1, 2, 3, 4, and under a half. So they're basically just under a quarter as well of the whole scene. You can do the same thing for finding the center point of your drawing, so you can keep measuring until you find the point at which it's the same, you have to travel the same distance to get to the right hand side of the image as the left. So let's go from here. We've got the point of our pen in the center there, so that's 1, and that's about half. So we know that our halfway mark is just next to this little tree, this little building. Now you don't have to measure every single aspect of the scene, but when you're first blocking it in, you can find all your major landmarks this way. So we know that this little, if we want to sketch in this little house, it's going to sit just a little kind of cube just on the left hand side of the center point. We know that this was just under a third, and then the overall size of it was just under a quarter, so we can kind of block in those widths. We can measure where this tree is, which is probably just over a third by the looks of it, 1, 2, just over a third. So we could kind of note where that tree is, maybe put a little circle, we know it's in line horizontally with that building. we can see, looks to me like this is almost the same distance. Yes, you can start to see comparisons. The bottom of this tree is almost the same distance away from the left-hand edge as the edge of this building is away from the right-hand edge. So we could block that in then and put it there. To do, I'll just do a quick demo of this in the last 5 minutes. Put my drawing, try and get the best, I'll zoom out actually, give a bit more space. So we've got our drawing down below. I'm going to block in a similarly proportioned rectangle. So if you want to find the exact relationship between the height and the width of your rectangle you've selected, you can measure, in this case because it's horizontal, you want to pick the shortest side first. So the height fits basically about 1 2/3 for the width. So we've got 1 to here, 2/3 goes to about here. So that's reasonably approximate, but it's fine for what we're doing. If you're drawing in pencil, you can just lightly sketch this in. That way you can kind of play around with the boundaries as you work. So I'm going to zoom back in here. Might need to try to keep everything in frame actually. Drop this down. Yeah, about there seems good. So I wouldn't do this if I was actually drawing it, but I'm going to make this really clear where this boundary is. So we've got a very clear boundary. So let's start again. We said that these buildings are 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, oh actually 4, quarter. So I measured that wrong initially. It's actually just a quarter, which makes it quite straightforward. I can make a little note of the halfway point there. So basically divided up into eighths now, so I've got my quarter marks as well. So we know that the left-hand edge of the buildings falls on the quarter mark. We know that the other building sits, actually let's figure out center mark. Center mark might be this. Yep, so that's quite easy. This line of trees is basically the center of the image vertically. And that runs over where our buildings are. And you can kind of gauge by eye. As I say, you don't want to be too prescriptive, so we'll say the top of the building's about there. So if that's halfway, we can mark our quarters as well. So you'd measure, again, what's a quarter of the overall height. So we know that the buildings sit a little bit higher, so we can start to block them in. They're going to fit a shape kind of approximately like this. So we can block them in quickly. Now that we've got those in place, we can kind of gauge the rough size of the other shed that's going to be placed here. And we said that the tree sits about the same distance as the buildings, maybe a little bit closer in, so we know the tree sits a bit lower, and then it kind of stretches out. Start blocking it in. approximate shape of the tree. Got another little tree above it that we can see that sits over the center point. Then we can roughly, now that we've got all this stuff in place, we can kind of roughly block in the tree that sits between the two buildings, which sits something like that. We know that the background edge of those trees falls roughly in line with the left-hand side of that tree that we looked at before. And we can see that the line of trees, the highest point it goes is kind of just under a quarter, so we could then kind of loosely, because it's a landscape sketch, you don't have to be too detailed with it, start blocking in, looking at where these undulations in that dark section of tree behind kind of roughly match with the foreground elements. Something like that's probably about it. So then we can shade them in. They're a kind of dark note in the image. Once you've kind of got to that point, everything can kind of fall in quite naturally. The background's going to be looser anyway. You've got all your major landmarks in the scene. You could start looking for where the kind of little different sections of grass are horizontally. But that's basically how you actually place images within your crop scene. So you're looking for their proportional relationship to the scene to match both, so your drawing is the same as what you're looking at in reality. And it takes a bit of practice, so I'd recommend doing it in pen, like little drawings in pen like this to begin with, before you would attempt to do anything in paint. But yeah, that's pretty much it for today. Hopefully it's helpful. We're going to be looking at how you can kind of make use of these skills in later lessons, how you can make a kind of more fully fledged sketch. Though as far as sketching is concerned in pen, something like this to kind of capture a general sense of a scene is really useful. It's a good way to test the composition as well, so before doing something more finished, you can sketch something out in about 5 or 10 minutes like this, make some decisions. At that point you can start to move stuff around, so once you're comfortable with being able to copy the relationship as it is, you can start to play around with that relationship, and that's where that idea of the still yard came in, where we could maybe it feels like everything's a little bit too much on this right hand side and you want something interesting on the left hand side. You can either pick an object and move it, you can copy an object. Landscape's really flexible that way, which makes it really enjoyable to work with. But yeah, that's it for this week. Hopefully it's helpful. As always, you can, if you're part of the OCAD program, if you signed up, you can get in touch and I'll give you feedback about your work. Otherwise, you can watch stuff on YouTube or the blog. But I'll see you guys soon. Bye.